Well, Jordan, how are you doing this morning?
Doing very well. Really excited to chat with you today.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. Do you mind giving us a brief bio and some of the big ideas you're interested in?
Yeah, absolutely. So my very quick bio, I grew up in Los Angeles, nice Jewish kid, kind of expected since childhood that I would go, be a nice doctor. I went off to college. I went to Princeton University, and when I graduated, I joined the United States Marine Corps. I did 5 years as an infantry officer, two tours overseas, and decided to get out around 2014. At that point, I had the GI Bill, so I figured I would use it for everything it was worth. And I went to law school because I wanted to dive into kind of great ideas about the American economy or Constitution, and also went to business school thinking that I would have a career um, uh, in the private sector. And through a series of sort of serendipitous events, ended up connecting with Eric Schmidt, the former Google CEO, and went to go work for him for 5 years, helping him stand up his new philanthropic organization, Schmidt Futures. So had an amazing experience there. Got some real insight into some of the challenges we face on the technology side and the national security side, and used that to launch what I'm now doing, which is creating this new fund called America's Frontier Fund. It's a nonprofit deep tech investment fund focused on ensuring the United States wins the next great power competition against China, which is focused on technology. And throughout that process, while I was doing that, I wrote a book with my best friend called Union. It's a road trip narrative, very similar to kind of Jack Kerouac on the road. And it explores why we are so polarized today and what actually unites us, despite the default narrative that we are so divided. So that's my quick background. I think some of the big ideas that I'm really passionate about right now, which kind of play into both my book and my current work. The first is this question of in this next century, this next great power competition, um, you know it's very clear today that China invests for power and the US invests for profit. And how does that lead to very different outcomes for our economies? And what does it say for our long term strength as countries, and how that competition will play out? And I think the US has some amazing advantages, but it also puts us at some disadvantage relative to a country like China that can top down direct where it wants technology to develop. And then on the other side, I've always loved theories about U.S. constitutional law and what it is that really unites us and binds us back to this founding moment, but also makes it a ongoing democratic experiment going forward that we all have this amazing opportunity to participate in and shape going forward.
I love that. I love that. I want to get started. There's so much I want to dig into, but I want to get started with one of the first things you mentioned. After you left Princeton, this elite institution, you went into the Marine Corps. Uh, and recently, I was listening to a general. He was talking about this, and he's like, "This doesn't happen anymore." You know what I mean? Like students, like from elite colleges, very rarely go into the military. Like it's declined immensely. What's your sense of why that is? Is it just because the military is kind of a red tribe institution, and so like it's kind of taboo to come out of this core left wing institution? Maybe you get brainwashed a little bit. I don't know. I don't know what happens, but like something happens, and then suddenly you never want to go work in the military.
Yeah, it's a great question. I had a sort of unique experience. As I said at the beginning, I always thought I was going to be a doctor, and I even applied to medical school. And I was going through college in '05 through '09, which was sort of the heart of the surge in Iraq.
Gotcha.
And there was something interesting where you had this generation of leaders go overseas, do incredible things, and they all joined before 9/11 or right after 9/11.
Right.
And they came home, they wrote books about it, and they inspired the next set of us. And so, growing up, I read Nate Fix, One Bullet Away, and Ry Barcott, and Elliot Ackerman, and these incredible uh, leaders who I wanted to be like them. I aspired to their sort of integrity and heroism and courage, and I wasn't unique there. So when I graduated college, I think there were 10 of us who joined the military from my Princeton class, which was actually a fairly high number, relative to the years before, where it was maybe one or two. And so I think there was this group who were graduating around '07 to 14 that were very inspired by that wave. And so in my officer candidate school class of 40 infantry, 40 officers, I'd say 10 of the 40 were from very elite Ivy League schools who all just were inspired in some way or another, and they actually were fairly liberal. My bunkmate at OCS, he's now running for office as a Democratic candidate for elected office, and so it was much more diverse than I think people expect. And again, there was that sort of amazing moment where we were all inspired by the group ahead of us to go serve. And I think that's still there today. Maybe the urgency has gone down a bit, just given we aren't in active wars anymore. And so when I step back and say, okay, what is happening? I think there are two facts that are really important. One is we no longer have a draft. We have an all volunteer army, all volunteer military. It means we actually don't need all that many people, and so the slice of America that goes into the military, it's just very small, period, and we don't want that many people because it's a highly specialized, highly elite armed forces. So that's the first fact, and I think the second fact is that shift to an all volunteer military happened, at a moment when all these new sort of power law type career options emerged. And so, in the 1980s, you had the rise of Wall Street, and, in the 90s, you had the rise of the internet. And so when you contrast the sort of the more standard career of a military officer's life with this potential to, create vast fortunes or power on the private side, I think you got this flood of, top graduates heading into those careers and overlooking the military as an option. And I think that's not unique to the military. I think it's true across public service and a variety of other professions. But that to me would account for most of it. I found the officer corps to be highly diverse. It might have even slanted a little bit left, while the enlisted corps maybe sort of slanted right. But that's sort of my take on it.
That's great. That's great. Well, you mentioned something very interesting there. I think this is a great segue. You mentioned the rise of power law careers, perhaps around knowledge work, the internet, things like that, and driving people into kind of a narrow set of career options at the elite level. Because you could go out, you can make a huge amount of money in finance, or you can use technology to leverage that to make just much larger sums of money than you traditionally could. There's a great book, Coming Apart, that kind of describes kind of this forking of class in America, especially among American whites, which happened right around the same time. How much do you think this rise of these kind of power law careers has fed into political polarization? And it used to be there's a great anecdote I've heard that Maytag, this great American company based in Illinois, in the 60s, the CEO lived in the same town with a couple of doctors, a couple of lawyers, the plumber, and just some other guy was there, just everyday people. He would live in the same town with the factory. Now he lives in a big city and he takes his private jet in. And this is it's this completely different thing, right? It's just much more separated from each other. Do you think these rise of power law careers has contributed to political polarization in some sense?
Yes, I certainly do. I think it's one of multiple factors, but it's an important one. And I think over the last 20, 30 years, there was a dominant liberal internationalist worldview that essentially said, globalization is good. It's good to be a citizen of the world, and we should kind of adopt that view. And it fit the moment for America because we were the unipolar power, and what was good for the world we thought was good for us, and vice versa. And I think it's turned out that that's just not true, and I think it ended up benefiting, the top echelon of American society infinitely more, and everybody else was actually fairly hurt by it. And I think you could point to a number of areas where that's true. The offshoring of American manufacturing and the loss of jobs, which is now in turn reducing innovation in a variety of areas, as our manufacturing base for deep tech is now overseas. Loss of middle class income. That sort of enabled this vibrant social fabric that we once had with communities. You can kind of go down the list, but I think it's a major factor. I think both globalization and technology operate on a power law, and so the convergence of those two forces over the last 30 years created this super maelstrom that really did eviscerate social capital across the United States and have significant consequence. And I think one thing that'll be interesting is as globalization seems to be hitting a wall and maybe even receding, and we're coming to the end of this next, the last wave of technology kind of based on semiconductors and Moore's law. whether we actually will see some reformation of American social capital. I think that to me is one of the more interesting X factors over the next couple of decades.
I love that. I love that. Jordan, you wrote a really excellent book that you mentioned on, taking this journey with your friend across the country in several different spurts. It wasn't all at once. But I really love the book. And I'm curious, there's a lot of reflections around political polarization. You're more conservative, he was more liberal, and how you could kind of come together throughout those kind of differences. Has writing the book and talking to all these people from all different walks of life made you more optimistic or more pessimistic about the state of political polarization in the U.S.?
I think it did both, and I know that it's not a satisfying answer, but on the one hand, our experience out on the road was that Americans are far less divided than it seems. When you can sit down over a meal and break bread with someone, you find that you have all these values in common, and these are values that are shaped by our experience as Americans. I think the founding ideals all the way through to today kind of creates this implicit bond and shared civic religion among Americans that you just find over and over again in town across America. And when you can get to that point of sitting down over a meal, you can find those commonalities. And I think it's also true on policy. I think we're not as far apart on policy as it might seem. And so that gave me a lot of optimism that going forward, we just heard over and over from Americans that they're sick of being divided. They don't want to be put into these camps anymore, and they want to transcend it. And so that's on the one hand. And then on the other, it's hard to look at what's going on with social media and our political system and not see that it is deliberately pushing us into those camps. And it's doing everything it can to activate our outrage buttons and constantly just trigger us into seeing the other side as the enemy. Our politics thrives on it. Our social media and media companies thrive on it. And that sort of systemic kind of cleavage is very destructive. And you could just see it over and over and over again over the last 5 years, how these issues were manufactured. They were designed to kind of push us into camps. And even when people know that that's happening, they can't help themselves from falling into it. I think Chris and I found that on the road over and over again. We were writing a book about finding common ground, and we still found ourselves fighting on some of these issues, knowing what was happening to us. And so I think the challenge for America is, one, how do we, at a policy or social, societal, and economic level, kind of rejigger these things so that they aren't by default dividing us. And then second, how do we as individuals and family members and communities learn what's happening, learn to understand our emotions and why something triggered us or not, and to be able to go a level up and say, okay, I know why I feel this way, but how can I continue to have a good conversation, a good relationship, see the best in the other side, and not fall prey to this, what I honestly view as sort of a marionette style manipulation.
Absolutely. It does seem to be just kind of quite pernicious. I'm curious, as you traveled across the country with Chris, what's your sense of how healthy community is? There's a great scene in the book where you talk about you go to a gun range, you take Chris shooting for the first time, and they invite you back for beers and brats afterwards. It seemed like in this really small town, I think it was in Arizona, there seemed to be some real sense of community that still existed. But Americans seem to get lonelier every year. If you look at the percentage of people that has a best someone that they would call their best friend, it's been dropping for the last kind of 30 years. What's your sense of how healthy community is in the U.S.? Is it pretty healthy, or is it pretty bad off right now?
Unfortunately, my personal view is that it's fairly bad off across most of the country. And I think community comes from two things. I think it comes from shared values, shared rituals, a space in the community that is viewed as somewhat sacred, that you can put aside kind of the normal grind of daily life and come together over something special or unique. You see that, for instance, in religions where you have Shabbat dinner in the Jewish community or church on Sunday. It's a special space. And again, it doesn't have to be religious. I think you can have it in the town square as well. So that sort of shared values, shared rituals. And then on the other, I think it comes from common struggle. So what is something that we have to struggle over together? that builds resilience and again stronger bonds. And it's hard to identify where those are in American society today. I think there is a broad lack of meaning and purpose that creates that sense of shared values, shared rituals. Especially in big cities, it's just very hard to find that. And as more and more Americans kind of flow to those bigger cities, I think you see that that absence of meaning. Like where does someone find a sense of purpose? It's not to say it isn't there, and I think for a lot of individuals, they do still find it. And so, I think my broad generalization is not to say it doesn't exist, but that it is far less than it might have been in the past. And then on the other side, we haven't seen much shared struggle. I think there's a lot of individual struggle across the country. I think a lot of people are suffering. There's the opioid crisis that is just so dramatic. There's the over-incarceration challenge. There's homelessness and poverty. All these things are terrible, but it hasn't created a sense of shared struggle, that we're all in this together. And I think that's one of the things that Charles Murray talks about in Coming Apart. I think Robert Putnam talks a lot about it as well. And that lack of common struggle, makes it so that we don't feel like we have that much in common anymore. And while I believe, given my experience in the Marines, that when you put Americans to the test, they rise like no other people I've ever seen. They have this incredible spirit that I think is unique to Americans because of our values, because of the way our country understands itself. And you see it over and over again overseas, but most Americans don't get to experience that. And so I think that lack of common struggle has made it so we don't find the same trust when things go bad. You saw this with COVID, unfortunately, that something that could have been a common struggle ended up becoming an individual struggle for a lot of reasons, and you didn't have that sense of trust across the entire country. And even that is overdependent because it flows from our political polarization into what could have been this unifying moment. But that to me is sort of the defining feature of our social fabric today. That lack of meaning, lack of common struggle has left us in a place of less community, less trust.
Well, that's a great transition point. It seems to me like our last great unifying force was the Soviet Union, and you're working on our next great, what I say is our next great unifying kind of force to push against, which is a great power conflict with China. What do you think? How does the scale look when you look at? There seems to be this weird thing where a lot of people I talk to, they're either like, well, China has this crazy demographic problem. The pyramid's upside down. They're not going to be able to fund their liabilities. It's not a serious threat. We have nothing to worry about. And then there's people that say they're so far ahead of us. They're so much smarter. There's no way we can do anything about it. It seems to me like it's probably more in the middle somewhere. Like it's probably going to be closer than that. But what is your sense of the great power conflict with China? How do we stack up against each other? And perhaps what can we do to make America more competitive?
It's a great question. So I agree. We're sort of at the early stages of this new, long-term competition, and some people call it a Cold War, some people call it a hot war, some people call it a techno-economic war. But there's no doubt we are now in a very fierce competition with China, and I think when these sort of competitions, these bipolar competitions emerge, whether in politics or among nations, I think there's a tendency for a lot of people to kind of either look at our strengths and their weaknesses and say, of course, like our economy is so much better than theirs. We're more innovative. They have these demographic problems. We don't have to worry. Or you look at your own weaknesses and their strengths and say, oh my God, we can't innovate. We're so sclerotic. They're racing ahead. They're pouring all this money into innovation. And neither of those are accurate. I think both countries have incredible strengths and both have a lot of weaknesses. And what that means is that the future is contingent. We don't know how it's going to go, but what does matter is what we do in that competition and how we, how we focus on our own system and ensure that we have the right, the right tools, the right innovation, the right talent focused on hard problems. And so, my view going into this is that it's the United States that will either defeat itself or push itself into another century of leadership of the global, international order, whatever you want to call it, because it's up to us. We have a lot of problems. We have incredible strengths, and we need to take this moment, recognizing that we actually do face a competitor for the first time in 50, 60 years, we face a serious competitor, which can act as a foil to us. It reveals some of our weaknesses or areas that we've underinvested in over the last few decades. And I think that's really important, but it also requires a seriousness of addressing those problems. Otherwise, we will certainly wake up in 20 years to a world that we are not the world's best technology leader, and China is. And I think that it's not to say there's anything wrong with the Chinese people. I think the Chinese people are incredible. I do think the Chinese Communist Party is not the world I want. I don't want a world dominated by them. They don't have the values I care about. A world like that means more insecurity. It means countries like Russia being given the green light to invade another country like Ukraine. It means less prosperity for the American people. It means a U.S. military that doesn't have the best technology on the battlefield and puts us at significant risk. And so all those things are reasons why I believe the country needs to come together around this issue and really take a serious eye towards how we need to drive forward innovation in parts of our economy that just haven't had it over the last few decades.
Definitely. Well, Jordan, it fills me with some hope that you're working on this problem because it's a bearable problem. What does it look like making sure the U.S. is competitive with China? Perhaps on your front, what you're working on with providing us with defensive capabilities. It seems quite disturbing to me. There's just so many. I guess kind of political economy problems with this. I think about the carriers. You've got these massive high capital cost kind of weapon systems that can be defeated with DF-21 very cheap like anti-ship missiles in mass. Like there's things like which I don't think people are really thinking about very much. There's a kind of a lack of automated systems, perhaps driven by like the pilot lobby in the Air Force. I don't know what's going on there. Maybe they just
Yep.
Top Gun probably did not help us at all. Great movie, but probably didn't help us on that front. But yeah, like what are you working on in particular? What big problems area do you see on the defense side that need to be buffed up, that can be buffed up?
Well, that was a great point, and I'll start with your point, which is the U.S. has invested so much in these huge military platforms, our aircraft carriers, our fighter jet programs, and it's not to say those are wrong. I think it's really important that we have those exquisite platforms that dominate the battlefield. But if the 20th century was all about scale, you need carriers that have scale, you need aircrafts that can dominate the airspace. It was all about scale. The 21st century is all about small units, highly empowered with technology that can swarm. And as you said, our aircraft carriers can be taken out by either tons of swift boats with explosives attached to them. That's a low-tech approach, or highly enabled drone technologies that can similarly swarm, and they're low cost and cheap. And so we've plowed a ton of money and invested heavily in these programs that take decades to be completed, and yet the fear is that by the time they're fielded on the battlefield, the other side will have technology that can easily take them out. And so that heavy investment, might be money being spent in areas that are not going to have the highest ROI for us. And so as we looked at this problem, there's been a variety of commissions over the last 5 years or so that have kind of came to the same conclusion, that we're falling behind in foundational technologies, things like microelectronics or artificial intelligence, synthetic biology, these technology areas that are a bit upstream from the dual-use application. So rather than focus on, do we have the best aircraft carrier, we should be looking upstream. Do we have the best AI? Because whoever has the best AI will make decisions faster on the battlefield. They'll have much higher competitive advantage in decision making, which then leads to all these downstream consequences. And the same is true with microelectronics. Whoever has the best chips has the best AI. They have the best weapon systems. They have the ability to shut off the world's supply chains to those chips. And so it gives all these advantages. And if we look at why the U.S. is falling behind in those areas, I think it essentially comes down to this political economy question, which is, a lot of those areas do not fit the venture model. And yet we've really leaned on the venture model for innovation over the last 20, 30 years. So venture has a 10-year fund duration. It's not a requirement. It's sort of an evolved custom. And 10-year fund durations mean that it's hard to invest in things that have long durations to maturity. So, a company that requires maybe 15 years to go from promising scientific idea to, prototype to commercial scale takes longer, and so venture funds will overlook it. They won't invest there because it's not quite ready. And if we had a well-functioning political economy, we might have easier to access government funding, better grant programs that could take higher risk. And we do have a variety of government programs, but I think universally it's recognized that those are just not that effective. And while there's lots of great people working on fixing them, they're just not meeting that challenge today. So in between, DARPA, which funds 20-year kind of breakthrough science R&D, and then the venture capital community, there is this gap in funding. And that's what our organization is trying to solve, is to figure out how we can get patient capital that is willing to take a longer timeline to see returns. It's not going to say we don't want returns. We need, at the end of the day, we need bigger returns, because the only way to know that something is truly a great technology and truly successful, it's an imperfect measure, but it is profit. It is the fact that it's achieved commercial scale, that it is so valuable and creates so much value for the economy that it generates substantial profits. But we think that it needs a longer time horizon. So that's the challenge we're trying to solve. I think there's a related challenge, which is these things just require upfront capital. To build a new microelectronic startup, it requires probably $30 million to get to first prototype. Whereas, for a SaaS company, you could get to $30 million in recurring revenue before you even, have to really invest in hardware. So that's the innovation challenge we face. And, the reason it matters relative to China is that the Chinese government can top-down direct their sovereign funds, their state funds, to invest heavily into those areas. And they can even tell them not to invest in social media companies and software companies, so that talent and capital all shifts into this other area. And so at a moment when the US is underinvesting, the Chinese might be overinvesting in those areas, and that creates real long-term risk for the United States. It means that on the Chinese side, they're getting the benefit of all these learning cycles, in the same way that Silicon Valley developed over decades as generations of entrepreneurs kind of tackled startups. Some failed, some succeeded, but they just kept learning and growing and innovating. The Chinese are going to be able to do that in these deep tech areas. In the US, we're moving too slow. So that's the challenge we're trying to solve.
Just move faster. It's really fascinating. You mentioned that time horizon. Kind of $20 bill you found on the sidewalk, because it's very similar to a previous guest we had on the show, Adam Marblestone's FROs, Focused Research Organizations. It's very much in the same vein of recognizing that there's certain, I guess, funding sizes and timescale returns that are not served because of kind of poor incentives, just in kind of the ether, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And if I had to distill the challenge, it's that we need a new way to finance innovation. I think for 70, 80 years, we had this incredible system that was developed. I think you could give most credit to Vannevar Bush in The Endless Frontier, and this amazing symbiosis between universities, federal government contracting, and the entrepreneurial ecosystem led to the sort of innovation model we have. And yet things are different today. I think that model isn't quite working as well as it once did. And so we need to innovate on how we finance innovation, I think. And Adam Marblestone is tackling that with the FRO concept, which I think is brilliant. And we got to collaborate with him when I was at Schmidt Futures. And there are other people in the ecosystem trying similar models. And I think what we're doing with America's Frontier Fund is just one more of those models to try to innovate on how we finance innovation. And our model is a bit more commercial focused than Adam's. Adam is looking at how you can use new structures like a nonprofit, but organized like a startup to achieve a breakthrough in basic research. And I think what we're looking at is how you can use a nonprofit to raise patient capital that can take a longer time horizon to invest in the things that come out of basic research. So, to ensure that whatever breakthroughs happen can still get to commercial scale. That's where I would sort of put those. But I find it to be a very exciting time as people are thinking very creatively about, how do we use the tools we have to accelerate or, rethink how we do innovation.
That's great. That's great. Are there any areas you see that the U.S. is kind of dragging behind in terms of innovation, or just like, I I guess, pure kind of onshore infrastructure. One thing I always go back to is my brother. He used to work he was a machine tooling, machine shop, and he's working on chaff for the F-16. But it's like the one shop in the United States, and it's like down the road from me in this like little podunk town. And there's like three guys. Like, there's probably two people that know how to do it, and they're like teaching my brother. You're like, wow, like if these people had a heart attack, we would really be in trouble as a country. That's how close it is. So is it like, are there like pure like on the ground tooling problems we have? Is it like more on like the frontier, like I guess hard tech, like technical developments, or is it like all of these things all at once?
I think it's all of these things all at once, and I think in some way we've had the luxury over the last 40 years of just sort of saying like, well, the American innovation base is the best in the world, and it talent will naturally just flow to the areas of highest opportunity and value, and I just don't think that's actually quite true. And I'm a conservative. I believe in the free market. I think it is the best engine for wealth creation and poverty alleviation in the world, but it doesn't always clear. The market doesn't always clear, and I think what we've found is both that there are inefficiencies in the U.S. economy. That means you end up with situations where it's like we only have one person who does this machining process, and the entire defense and industrial base is like dependent on this like one node. And if that node goes down, we actually face severe supply chain risk. So I think you have that problem. And then on the other side, you have market distortion. You have a Chinese economy that is willing to flood or subsidize its own sector with capital, so that it outperforms ours. And so it means we have certain deserts. We don't do low-end chip manufacturing in the U.S. because it's so much cheaper overseas, and that creates long-term challenges for the economy. And so, I think you have these inefficiencies that have emerged. As we think about going forward, what do we need to do to solve this at a policy level? I think there are two things that are important. I think one is we can't dominate all value chains across the world. If we said we want to dominate the semiconductor value chain from start to finish, so from designing the chips all the way through advanced fabrication, it's never going to happen. It's a global value chain. It's multiple trillions of dollars, and we just can't do it all. It would take more money than we have, and so we have to be very targeted and strategic about what we want to dominate. And as the U.S. government looks to pass the CHIPS Act and the bipartisan innovation bills, they should be thinking very seriously about where in the value chain is it truly critical for us to dominate and have strategic nodes. So I think that's first, is for the first time in a long time, being very thoughtful about where we develop technology. And I think the second is having a better understanding at a granular level of those supply chains. So, the U.S. government is the biggest buyer in the world of technology, and yet they don't know what the couple levels down supply chain is. So one of my colleagues was on the Defense Science Board, and what she found was that you couldn't tell where that one machinist is just based on the existing information the U.S. government has. But we should know that, and I'm sure the Chinese actually know it, but we should know it because it would help that market clear more effectively. Having such brittle supply chains, having dependencies on these small mom and pop shops for our most advanced equipment it's not an effective strategy. And so having better information, more data on where those brittle supply chains are can help us revitalize those supply chains, create more resiliency, and it can help talent and capital move towards areas of opportunity that at the moment they're not, because they have no visibility there.
That's great. This next question, it kind of flows through all of your work, so I'm really curious to get your take on it. It's a big kind of left-right, I guess, conflict point around defense spending. The thing I see about defense spending is that the problem is, we spend a lot of money on defense in this country, but if we decrease the amount we spend, it's not like there's a lot of special interest, and it's very difficult to dislodge these. It'd be nice to just like hand wave that away, but they are there, and they're very motivated to keep their kind of special interests, like the big, defense contractors, etc. And so if you decrease defense funding, you get less innovation, and you can't just like reallocate that very easily. So should we just be more biased towards like increasing defense funding, even though we already spend a lot, because you can take that new money and reallocate it to places where if it's already committed, it's very difficult to kind of dislodge that.
It's a great question. I think the defense spending debate is I think it's really focused in the wrong place. The vast majority of the defense budget goes to things that I would argue are just not that relevant anymore. A third of the defense budget alone is spent on education, healthcare, and social services for the military. It's not that that's bad. That's obviously needed when you have a standing all volunteer army military. So it's very important we do that. But when most people think like, oh, the defense budget's so big, I don't think they account for that fact. Then there's all this money going to legacy systems. The vast majority of the budget goes to legacy systems, and as we were just talking about, I think that money would be much better spent on advanced R&D and trying to get the best upstream technology. And so, I think the defense budget debate always kind of comes down to like Democrats want it lower and Republicans want it higher. And really, we should be saying like, where should this money be going? We want the U.S. to have the best technology. We want to have the most capable military. What is the best way to achieve that? And it's not necessarily a bigger budget, but it's probably a budget where the priorities are different. And if you could spend hundreds of billions of dollars more a year on advanced R&D for artificial intelligence or commercialization of semiconductor disruptive technologies, we would be in a much better place as a country than we are today. And on the left side, I think often the desire is, well, let's reduce the defense budget so we can increase various domestic spending programs. And I just disagree with that, because at the end of the day, the thing that will lift up more Americans, create more jobs, create more wealth, collective wealth, are breakthroughs in advanced technology. I very much agree with the Endless Frontier and Vannevar Bush that the greatest way we can lift all boats is through that innovation, and we should be putting more money there, not less. And as you've seen, federal spending towards R&D has just gone down dramatically over the last half century and continues to do so. Maybe it ticked up a little bit the last few years, but it should be 4 or 5 times as much as it is today. And some of that could come from the defense budget, and I think it would actually meet the purpose of having the most capable military and the strongest strategic position for the United States.
That's great. Well, you mentioned the research budget, and I'm curious. As best we can tell, it seems like the average scientist is probably 2% as effective as one was in 1950, probably due to all kinds of different factors. I'm curious, do you think it has gotten harder to find new innovations? Have we picked all the low-hanging fruit? Now it's just much more difficult to get up the tree to find that next apple, or is it like kind of a psychological thing where maybe we're not trying as hard, or the money's not going to the right place, it's just going to older scientists or something like that, and they're all just politicians who are going to get money, and the weird people all got kicked out on the street or something like that? Like, what do you think's going on there?
It's one of those. I think it's an overdetermined problem. I think it's kind of all the above. I do think there is some of that fishing out problem that we have kind of gotten a lot of the low hanging fruit, and the next breakthroughs are maybe a little harder. I think it's that if you go back 60, 70 years, the average university president was in his 40s. Today they're in their 70s. I think it's true across departments, and maybe it leads to a more risk-averse profession. I think the way grant money is given out probably also has some effect there. It's harder to be a non-consensus thinker today in the academy. So I think it's all the above. I'm not an expert in this area, so I don't really have any smart view on it.
Gotcha. I want to do some final questions around the Constitution and how we think about the Constitution. The Constitution is not just a living document; it's kind of the set of norms we have around it, and it can evolve and change. You've got a legal background. You've written a book on political polarization. How should we theorize about how the Constitution actually works? In the Supreme Court, do they sit together in a quorum and they kind of interpret this and hand down verdicts to the rest of us? How impartial are they? Do you think they do a fairly good job, a poor job, something in between? Yeah, generally, what do you think about kind of the state of the Constitution at this point?
Yeah, well, it's such a relevant question given what's happening with Roe v. Wade, and I think sadly, the Supreme Court was sort of the last holdout of a hyper politicized America, and now today it's sort of over 20 years has sort of now fallen prey to the same hyper polarization forces. The reason I love the Constitution so much and constitutional philosophy is it's just so rich, and so many brilliant thinkers have spent their lives diving into it and coming up with incredible theories over the last 2.5 centuries. And it pulls from the best of various philosophical traditions and religious traditions, and there's some Talmudic elements to it. It's just a fascinating area of study. And the theory I liked the best was one of my professors, Jack Balkin, what he called living originalism. And what he would argue is that the constitutional moment was a really important moment. The whole, of course, the Constitution was written by the framers, and they wrote rules in there, they wrote principles in there. But what really mattered was not who wrote it, but who ratified it. And the moment the Constitution was ratified, every state had the opportunity to essentially have their own process. And nearly all the states kind of expanded the electorate beyond anything that had ever happened in the history of humanity, so that more people than ever could vote on the Constitution. And of course, it was imperfect at the time, and for all the reasons everybody knows today, that women couldn't vote and African Americans couldn't vote. But it was this for the time it happened, it was the most democratic moment in history. And with that ratification, the important thing was, what did everyone think the Constitution meant? What did it mean to have a right to bear arms? And what did it mean to have equality under the law? And while there are certain hard rules in the Constitution, like, you can't be president until you're over 35, that's not open to interpretation. It's not like, well, 35 then is 65 today, so like you have to be 65. It's just a hard rule. But there are other things that are principles, and those principles are both timeless and ever-changing. Equality under the law is timeless, but our understanding of it evolves. And what matters is that every generation of Americans wrestles with what that means. What does it mean for us today to have equality under the law when, everybody with a cell phone can film you doing stuff? And so, like, does due process matter when you could sort of be crucified in the public square over social media and not get your day in court? So, like, how do we understand that? And so I think what I find beautiful is this idea that every generation gets to kind of renew that founding moment, because we all debate what it means over these principles, and ones that everybody knows: due process, equality under the law, equal opportunity. These are things that every generation gets to wrestle with, and in doing so, take part in that constitutional experiment and process, which I think is beautiful. I think the challenge today is that civic education is not that great anymore. I think very few people kind of understand the constitutional structures and what it means for them to engage over it. And so, the one upside of these conflagrations over things like Roe v. Wade or others is it gives us the opportunity to talk about this and to kind of wrestle as a nation with, our constitutional process and how it should be evolving given dramatic changes to the nature of society over the last 250 years. But that's the theory I love the most. I think it's beautiful. It ties into this idea of covenant, that we're all bound together, and the project makes us something more than we were before. It's not just an I-you, it's a we, and how that forms is through that process of engagement. So that's my favorite theory. We wrote about it a bit in the book, so I'd actually love to hear your thoughts on that. And given the number of people you've talked to and what you read in the book, like how do you see what's going on with the Constitution and how it applies to us today?
I really love that theory. I think it's I think it's great. The one challenge I see is just this problem. It's like kind of like the Norway problem. It's like America was much smaller then, and it's like kind of easier to get consensus when you just have less people to go talk to, right? And there's less nodes in the network that you have to kind of bring people together. It's challenged to scale this up, and I think we've done, like, all things considered, a pretty decent job. But I do really like that that theory, I think it makes a lot of sense. It's really cool.
Well, so to your point, I think one of the there's another law professor at UT, Sanford Levinson, who argues that for most of our history, we've iterated on those principles. So, what does equality under the law mean? and we haven't really iterated on structures. And so maybe given changes to our society, it's time to innovate on the structure a little bit. Like does the electoral college make sense? Does the two-person Senate proportional House make sense? And can we innovate on some of that to create a better functioning system? And there are structures in the Constitution that allow you to innovate. So it's a good point you raise. I think it's worth a lot of deep thought about how we account for the size and scale that we're at now relative to a past era, and how social media, I think, turns local issues into national issues in a way that's new and creates difficulties.
Yes, absolutely. Well, one final question for you, Jordan. Long term, do you think we will see kind of political polarization kind of recede, or does it just kind of get crazier and crazier? And if you see it receding, what does that path kind of look like, do you think? Is it like culminating around some kind of great power conflict with China? Is it something else?
I sort of ascribe to the cycles of American history theories where I think we tend to arrive at some consensus, some dominant sort of approach that leads to 30, 40 years of shared understanding and stability, which then begins to unravel a bit, and as the world changes and the economy changes, we then start to drive apart, and then something happens that creates a new consensus. So if you look at leading up to World War II, you had a very hyperpolarized country, very different views on how to respond, and then coming out of it, you had a very sort of aligned nation for 30, maybe 20 years or so. Similarly, a lot of social tumult in the 60s and 70s, and then with the Reagan era, you had sort of a shared view that big government should come to an end, and we should have lower taxes, less regulation, pro-business environment, and you got the sort of next wave, and even Bill Clinton kind of accepted that sort of dominant view and governed that way. And so I think you have those cycles, and I think we're in one of them right now. I think it's going to stay fairly tumultuous for the next 5 to 10 years as we wrestle with this new environment and what ideas can actually transcend it. And I do think at some point we will have a new consensus in the country that will inaugurate, hopefully 20 years of just great prosperity and growth and collective purpose for the country. That's my hope. Again, I said at the beginning that I think all of this is contingent, so it really depends on what we do.
Really well put. Well, Jordan, thank you so much for coming on the show. Where can people find the book, and where can people find your work?
Oh, thank you. So Union the book is it's on Amazon. My author's name is Chris Ha. He's an amazing writer from Berkeley. And my best friend. So I hope people check it out. It's a fun, quick, easy read. And they can learn more about America's Frontier Fund at americasfrontier.org and see what we're up to. It's an unusual fund as a nonprofit, but we think it has the potential to really help galvanize more investment and more innovation in deep tech. So we're really excited about our new mission there.
That's awesome. Well, thank you, Jordan. And just for the audience, I really love the book, so I encourage you to check it out.
Thank you.